Heads turned instantly, because when Jasmine pulled up the receipts, it wasn't just a scandal. It looked like a full-blown operation, hiding in plain sight. By the end of the hearing, every member realized she wasn't accusing someone of corruption. She was drawing a map to it, and the map led somewhere no one expected. Before we reveal how Jasmine Crockett connected dots that exposed a multi-million-dollar corruption network inside the Department of Homeland Security, make sure you smash that subscribe button, because this story involves paper bag bribes, taxpayer money, mysteriously flowing to connected companies, and the moment when a cabinet secretary realized she'd been caught. The House Judiciary Committee chamber felt different that morning. Maybe it was the unusually large press presence. Reporters who typically skip routine oversight hearings had shown up in numbers that suggested someone had tipped them off that something significant might happen. Maybe it was the way Kristi Noem, Trump's newly confirmed Secretary of Homeland Security, had arrived with an unusually large legal team for what was supposed to be a standard budget accountability session. Or maybe it was the expression on Jasmine Crockett's face as she organized a thick stack of documents at her seat, that particular combination of calm and anticipation that trial lawyers get when they know they're about to present evidence that changes everything. Noem opened with confident testimony. She talked about border security achievements, about streamlining DHS operations, about the important work her department was doing to keep Americans safe. She had that practiced political polish that comes from years of giving speeches and deflecting difficult questions. When she spoke about fiscal responsibility and efficient use of taxpayer resources, she looked directly at the Democratic members of the committee as if daring them to question her stewardship. She clearly thought this was going to be like every other congressional hearing, some pointed questions, some rehearsed answers, maybe a few viral clips for both sides, and then everyone moves on. She had no idea what Jasmine Crockett had been building for the past 6 weeks. The first few rounds of questioning were predictable. Republican members asked softballs about border apprehensions and thanked Noem for her service. Democratic members asked pointed but expected questions about detention conditions and budget priorities. Noem handled it all smoothly, occasionally consulting with the attorneys flanking her, but mostly projecting confidence and control. She was running out the clock, giving answers that sounded substantive but said nothing, a skill that seasoned political figures develop to survive oversight hearings. Then Crockett got her turn. She didn't start with accusations or confrontation. She started with what sounded like a simple factual question. Secretary Noem, can you tell this committee about the contract awarded last month to Sentinel Border Solutions for technology infrastructure at detention facilities? Specifically, I'm interested in the dollar amount and the bidding process. Noem looked slightly puzzled. It seemed like a technical question about a specific contract, the kind of thing that staffers usually handle. Congresswoman, I'd have to review the specific contract details, but DHS awards hundreds of contracts through proper procurement procedures. The amount was $12.4 million, Crockett said, reading from her document. Awarded on a no-bid emergency basis to Sentinel Border Solutions. Does that sound right? One of Noem's attorneys leaned over and whispered something. Noem nodded. That sounds approximately correct, yes. The no-bid designation was based on time-sensitive security needs. And who owns Sentinel Border Solutions? Crockett asked, her tone still conversational, still seemingly just gathering information. Noem hesitated for just a fraction of a second. I'm not familiar with their ownership structure off the top of my head. Let me help you out, Crockett interrupted smoothly, pulling out another document. Sentinel Border Solutions is a subsidiary of Fortress Management Group, and Fortress Management Group is owned by a private equity consortium that includes several investors who are, shall we say, politically connected to the current administration. She looked up from the paper. In fact, one of the largest investors is someone who was a major donor to both your gubernatorial campaigns and to President Trump's campaign. His name is Marcus Steinberg. Ring any bells, Secretary? The room's energy shifted immediately. Reporters started typing faster. Other committee members looked up from their phones. Noem's confident expression flickered slightly. Congresswoman, I don't involve myself in the ownership structures of every company that DHS contracts with. No, but you do involve yourself in which companies get $12 million in no-bid contracts, Crockett shot back. And here's what's interesting. Sentinel Border Solutions didn't exist 18 months ago. It was created specifically after you were nominated for this position. The company has no track record, no previous government contracts, no demonstrated expertise in border technology. But it does have investors who are your political allies and donors. So help me understand, Secretary. How does a brand new company with no experience get a $12 million no-bid contract from your department? Noem tried to regain her footing. The procurement process follows strict guidelines. The procurement process, Crockett interrupted, has an exception for emergency no-bid contracts that you personally can authorize, which you did, for a company owned by your donors. Do you see why that looks problematic? One of Noem's attorneys tried to interject with a procedural objection, but Chairman Jim Jordan, recognizing that this was getting substantive and couldn't be easily dismissed, allowed Crockett to continue. Noem was visibly uncomfortable now, her earlier confidence evaporating. But Crockett wasn't done. In fact, she was just getting started. Secretary Noem, the Sentinel contract, is just one piece of this. Let me show you something else. She pulled out what appeared to be a flow chart, holding it up so the cameras could see. This is what I call a corruption map. And over the past 6 weeks, my staff and I have been following the money flows out of your department. Want to know what we found? She didn't wait for an answer. In the 5 months since you took office, DHS has awarded over $78 million in contracts to companies that have direct financial connections to Trump administration officials, donors, or family members. 78 million. And here's the pattern. Most of these contracts are classified as emergency or time sensitive, which allows them to bypass normal competitive bidding. Most of them go to newly created companies with no track record. And most of them involve services that could easily be provided by existing contractors at lower cost. She pointed to different parts of her chart. Sentinel Border Solutions, 12.4 million, owned by your donor. Guardian Logistics, 8.2 million. CEO is a former campaign staffer. Patriot Security Systems, 15 million. Majority shareholder is the brother-in-law of a White House advisor. Should I keep going, or are you starting to see the pattern? The committee room was completely silent, except for the sound of camera shutters and frantic typing. Noem looked trapped, consulting urgently with her attorneys. Republican members were shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't partisan bickering. This was documented financial connections that were hard to explain away. Then Crockett shifted to her secondary target. But it's not just about the contracts, is it, Secretary Noem? Let's talk about American law enforcement officer, and now border czar, Tom Homan. Are you aware that Ms. Homan is currently under investigation by the Inspector General for accepting cash payments from contractors? Noem's face went pale. I'm not aware of any substantiated. I have the IG report summary right here, Crockett said, holding up another document. It details an incident where Mr. Homan allegedly received $50,000 in cash, delivered in a paper bag, from a representative of a detention facility contractor. The contractor received a $75 million facility expansion approval 3 weeks after that payment. The Justice Department opened an investigation and then, mysteriously, closed it without charges. Can you explain why your deputy is still in his position despite these allegations? Noem tried to deflect. I can't comment on ongoing investigations. The investigation is closed, Crockett corrected sharply. Closed without explanation. Which brings me to another interesting pattern. Several investigations into potential corruption or abuse within your department have been closed or deprioritized since you took office. Almost like there's a systematic effort to ensure that friendly operators don't face consequences for behavior that would get anyone else prosecuted. She leaned forward, her voice taking on a harder edge. Secretary Noem, you came here today to talk about fiscal responsibility and efficient government. But what I'm showing this committee is a department that's been turned into a cash machine for politically connected companies. What I'm showing them is a pattern of no-bid contracts flowing to donors and allies. What I'm showing them is investigations into corruption being shut down. This isn't efficient government. This is what corruption looks like when it's systematic and protected from the top. Republican members finally tried to interrupt, arguing about relevance and procedure, but Crockett wasn't backing down. Mr. Chairman, I have one yes or no question for Secretary Noem, and I think the American people deserve a direct answer. Jordan, recognizing he couldn't shut this down without it looking like a cover-up, nodded. The gentle lady may ask her question. Crockett looked directly at Noem. Secretary Noem, have you or any members of your immediate family received any financial benefit, directly or indirectly, from companies that have received DHS contracts since you took office? Yes or no? The silence stretched. Noem looked at her attorneys. One of them whispered urgently. Finally, Noem spoke, her voice tight. I would need to review. It's a yes or no question, Secretary. Have you or your family financially benefited from companies getting DHS contracts? Noem's face was red now. My financial disclosures are all public record. That's not a yes or no answer, Crockett pressed. And the fact that you can't give a simple yes or no tells me everything I need to know. Let me help you out. Your husband's consulting firm was hired last month by Guardian Logistics, one of the companies that got an $8 million DHS contract to provide strategic advisory services for $200,000. That's in the public record, you're right. What's not in the public record is whether that consulting contract was discussed before or after Guardian got their DHS money. Want to clarify that for us? The room erupted. Democrats were demanding further investigation. Republicans were trying to change the subject. Reporters were shouting questions, and Noem looked like she desperately wanted to be anywhere else. But Crockett had one more revelation, and this one was designed to reframe the entire conversation. Here's what really troubles me about all this, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. For years, Republicans have talked about fiscal responsibility, about government waste, about the need to be careful stewards of taxpayer money. But what we're seeing here is the opposite of that. We're seeing a systematic looting of a federal department, with contracts being handed out like party favors to political allies. She pulled out one final document. And you know what makes it even worse? While you're funneling millions to connected companies, your department is cutting funding for actual law enforcement operations. Border Patrol agents are reporting equipment shortages. ICE investigators are being told to deprioritize financial fraud cases, probably because those cases might lead back to your contractor friends. You're literally defunding effective law enforcement to fund corruption. The defunding language was deliberate and devastating. Republicans had spent years attacking Democrats with that phrase. Now Crockett was turning it around, showing how corruption within their own administration was undermining actual law enforcement. Several Republican members looked genuinely angry, not at Crockett, but at the situation she was describing. Crockett wasn't finished making her point. Secretary Noem, I want to be very clear about something. This isn't about partisan politics. This isn't about policy disagreements. This is about you using your position to benefit yourself, your family, and your political allies at taxpayer expense. This is about you creating a system where connected companies get rich while the actual work of your department suffers. And this is about you shutting down investigations to protect people like Tom Homan, who are allegedly taking cash bribes in paper bags. She held up her corruption map again. This map I've created, it's not complete. I've only had 6 weeks and limited resources to investigate. Imagine what we'd find with full subpoena power and a proper investigation. Imagine how many more contracts we'd discover flowing to connected companies. Imagine how many more allegations of corruption have been buried. Noem tried one last time to defend herself. Congresswoman, you're making serious allegations without what? Crockett challenged. Without evidence? I have contracts with your donors' names on them. I have financial disclosures showing your family benefiting from companies getting federal money. I have Inspector General reports documenting corruption allegations against your deputies. I have budget documents showing law enforcement operations being cut while contractor payments explode. What more evidence do you need? The hearing continued for another hour, but the damage was done. Noem's subsequent answers were defensive and evasive. She couldn't explain the pattern of no-bid contracts to connected companies. She couldn't justify why investigations into corruption had been closed. She couldn't address why her husband's firm had received consulting payments from federal contractors. And every time she tried to pivot to talking about border security or other accomplishments, Democrats brought the conversation back to the money trail that Crockett had exposed. By the time the hearing ended, the story had already gone viral. Crockett exposes DHS corruption network was trending on social media. News outlets were pulling the contracts Crockett had referenced and finding even more connections she hadn't had time to mention. Government accountability organizations were calling for criminal investigations, and several Republican senators, recognizing the political danger of defending obvious corruption, started publicly calling for inspector general reviews. The backlash against Noem was swift and bipartisan. Within 48 hours, the Senate Oversight Committee announced they'd be launching their own investigation into DHS contracting practices. The Justice Department, facing pressure from the public exposure, reopened several cases that had been mysteriously closed, including the Tom Homan bribery allegations. And Noem, who'd arrived at the hearing confident and in control, was now doing damage control interviews, trying to distance herself from companies she'd previously had no problem awarding contracts to. Crockett gave a follow-up interview that crystallized why her exposure of the corruption network mattered. What we're seeing is not just individual bad actors taking bribes or companies overcharging for services. We're seeing systematic corruption, where an entire department has been turned into a mechanism for enriching political allies. Contracts aren't being awarded based on who can do the job best or most efficiently. They're being awarded based on who donated to the right campaigns or hired the right family members. She continued, and here's the authoritarian part that should concern everyone. When investigations into this corruption get opened, they get shut down. When inspectors general try to do their jobs, they face obstruction. The system that's supposed to provide accountability and prevent corruption has been corrupted itself. That's not just stealing taxpayer money, that's breaking the mechanisms that are supposed to stop theft. When asked about Noem's claim that the allegations were politically motivated, Crockett's response was pointed. I presented contracts, financial disclosures, and investigative reports. Those are facts, not politics. If Secretary Noem thinks facts are political attacks, that tells you she can't defend the actual substance of what she's been doing. And honestly, I don't care if she thinks this is political. The American people deserve to know when their tax money is being funneled to companies owned by a cabinet secretary's donors and benefiting her family. That's not a political issue, that's a corruption issue. 3 weeks after the hearing, Tom Homan quietly resigned, citing personal reasons, but clearly trying to get ahead of the renewed investigation into his alleged bribery. 2 of the companies Crockett had named in her corruption map had their contracts suspended pending review. And Kristi Noem, whose political star had been rising, found herself trapped in a scandal that had effectively ended her ambitions for higher office. For Jasmine Crockett, the hearing became another example of what separated her from typical politicians: the willingness to do the investigative work, to follow the money trail, to build the case, and then to present it in a way that couldn't be dismissed or deflected. She hadn't just accused Noem of corruption. She'd mapped it out, shown the connections, provided the evidence, and forced everyone watching to confront an uncomfortable reality about how power was being abused. In her closing statement during a follow-up committee session, Crockett summarized what the investigation had revealed. We've learned that corruption at this level isn't accidental. It's structural. It requires systems that bypass normal oversight. It requires investigations to be shut down. It requires people in positions of authority to choose enrichment over integrity. What we saw with Secretary Noem and her network wasn't a few bad apples. It was an orchard that had been planted, cultivated, and harvested for profit. And my job, our job as Congress, is to burn that orchard down and plant something better in its place. If this breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett exposed a multi-million-dollar corruption network inside the Department of Homeland Security showed you why oversight matters, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments when following the money reveals the truth. Drop a comment telling us what other agencies need this kind of scrutiny. And share this with anyone who believes that taxpayer money shouldn't be a slush fund for political allies. Your engagement helps us keep shining light on corruption until it can't hide anymore.